Hey everybody, welcome back to another year here on Hail State Debate, the YouTube channel where we break down Lincoln Douglas and public forum topics throughout the year to help you do well and reach your potential in debate. I am, as always, Brett Harvey. We have our team president, Alicia Brown. She is right here. And we are breaking down the first Lincoln Douglas topic of the year. Resolved in the United States, colleges and universities ought not consider standardized tests in undergraduate admissions decisions. What do you give it on a scale of 1 to 10?
I give this an 8 or 9 because there's a lot of room for this to be either a policy debate or for this to be a moral debate with all of the issues around access to college and the affordability of college right now. But there's also some room to be a squirrel if that's more up your alley.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I when we looked at these briefly on Twitter, we said that we kind of like this one. I definitely do. It may not be the broadest topic in the world, but I think that's okay. I think it's a fairly narrow topic, but it has a lot of different angles that you can take if you're creative. It's a good way to start the year, good warm-up. Also, I think it's fun because it's relevant to you guys, you know, as students. I mean, both of us have in our past had the experience of the glories of standardized testing, and you are right in the middle of it, so that's good. I did want to talk briefly in the introduction about a few major issues that I think are going to come up. So the first one is obviously one of the big issues that's going to come up on this resolution is going to be about disparities. We've got disparities based on socioeconomics, disparities based on race, disparities based on gender. And when we talk about those things in Lincoln Douglas, we have to be very, very careful, right? I mean, we want to make sure that we're being sensitive and treating people with dignity. For example, we're going to be talking about tests having disparities in terms of scores for people of different races and what's the cause of that. And is it caused by the test? Is it caused by society in general? That sort of thing. As you do that, you know, you need to be very mindful. My son is actually starting Lincoln Douglas debate this year, and in his first effort to look at this topic, you know, he said some things that I would cringe if I saw him do them in a round, so I hope you'll be careful with that. The second thing that I think you need to be mindful of is this is going to be a debate where if you want to do well, you really are going to have to understand a little bit about statistics, right? Because we don't go in and like observe individual admissions decisions, right? I mean, they happen in a black box that nobody really gets to go look into. So what we're going to be dealing with overwhelmingly is statistics about like how these standardized test scores predict success in college, how they're used in admissions decisions, how they have disparities and things like that. And you're going to need to understand some basic concepts. For example, right, you know, one big example would be the difference between causation and correlation, right? Just because you've got these standardized test scores that have disparities based on race, that doesn't necessarily mean that the test itself is biased. It could be that the test is reflecting larger issues in society, like larger systemic biases that affect society and education all down the road. And you're going to have to learn how to argue, right, about the difference, for example, between causation and correlation, right?
And another thing we need to think about is how the study is structured. Obviously, we're going to prefer studies with large sample sizes over a number of years. If we look at a study that starts immediately after a new policy goes into place, that's one that hasn't even had time for the policy to go into transition. Another thing to think about is, does it control for other factors? So studies that use regression analysis and assign R-squared values to tell you how much a certain factor is explained by a hypothesis, you're going to need to understand what those terms mean. And we can give you a very basic overview of what makes a good study and what doesn't.
Yeah, and from a really basic perspective, another thing you have to be aware of, frankly, is bias. Right. Obviously, these companies that produce these tests have a strong interest in having the tests continue to exist. And so they have folks out there doing research, and like the College Board, for example, and the ACT both publish their own studies. And, you know, I'm not going to tell you not to use them at all because some of them are done by reputable scholars. We're actually going to talk about a few of them later. But of course, they're open to be criticized by, you know, an opponent saying that study was bought and paid for by the company that does the SAT or the SAT. So you have to be aware of, you know, where they're coming from. And if you are using something that comes from a source that has a vested interest, you've got to be able to defend that, right? The other thing about this is I think it's a topic that has a lot of different like we said earlier, different approaches. There's a very practical, statistical, utilitarian approach, but there's also critical angles, like for critical debate, critical race theory, critical gender theory, things like that. Because I don't know if you know it or not, but the SAT has a super racist history. If you look back to the and we're going to talk about this in a minute, as a matter of fact, but if you look back on the history of the SAT, it is really, really racist. Like the people who founded it had some really bad ideas, and so it's not one of these cases where you kind of have to like stretch to find a racial or a bias or a gender angle. They're right there in plain sight, I think.
Well, the other thing is to remember that bias doesn't have to be something inherently malicious. I mean, you might get into conversations about how cultural references in reading passages can be preferable to one kind of student or another. So even something as simple as having a passage on earthquakes is going to be easier for Californians than it is for people in Mississippi like ourselves.
There was one example from the 1980s where the SAT had a question. It said, I think, runner is to marathon as oarsman is to regatta. Now, I don't know about you. I haven't been to a regatta in a while. I know that maybe some of you who are out there at the country day schools of the world, maybe you have your regular weekly regatta coming up, but we don't have a lot of those. So, yeah, I mean, that's a good point. The structure of the test, and we're going to actually talk about that later. Do you have any other specific thoughts on it before we move on?
I think we're going to move into definitions.
Okay, before we do that real quick, let's talk a little bit, if you're new to the channel, so some of you may be here for the first time because it is a new year, just to let you know who we are. We're basically a channel of college debaters, coaches, debaters, things like that. And we focus on Lincoln Douglas and public forum debate, and we kind of focus on strong argumentation that is rooted in real world arguments. Because frankly, there are plenty of sites out there and plenty of YouTube channels that kind of focus on the inside baseball of debate about like theory and that sort of stuff. And we're not against that, right? But we really do believe that the best debating in terms of education, but also the best like winning debate, right?
And if you're looking for arguments that tell you that every policy is going to lead to nuclear war or
that's
mass starvation, that's not us.
We make fun of those. I mean, we do. Now, I'm not saying you should not run that. If you're in a league that values that,
and we're going to give you some unconventional arguments every now and then, but honestly, for a topic like this one, it would be in your best interest to run it relatively straight up, but be prepared for those who might choose not to.
Right. So we're all about arguments that could survive either in a very advanced, rigorous kind of circuit style round because they are well resourced, but also in a more traditional type circuit and in the real world. So that's what we do because, we do believe that debate that kind of has that common grounding in the real world is better for everybody. It's more fun, it's more accessible, it's more educational. I might do a rant about that in the future, but I'll spare it for now. We do from time to time use a little bit of debate jargon. So if you are new and you don't understand something, feel free in the comments below. Ask a question. There are no bad questions. We will try to answer as quickly as possible. We want this to be useful to everybody in the country that wants to use it. So if you have questions about like a term we used or an idea we used or a source, put them down there. We'll get to them as quick as we can. In addition to that, as always, we will drop the sources we cite in the notes below along with timestamps if you want to skip around or come back to a specific part. We want it to be useful. So if it is, please do like and subscribe. Tell a friend if it's useful. If it's not useful, tell an enemy. Remember that we are on Twitter at Hail State Debate. We do periodic announcements, little brief ideas about the topic there. And in addition to that, if you have novices on your squad, we have a separate video for the novice civil disobedience topic, and we will link that in the notes below if you just want to send them to that, or you can just find it on the channel. So that's kind of all of our spiel. We hope it's useful to you. So without further ado, we will move on to definitions, values, criteria, and those assorted things. Okay, so we will now move to what we sort of call the framework part of the analysis. We're going to do definitions, values, and criteria, and sort of the things that frame the case. And then next, as always, we will do a little bit of context, a little bit of background and history. I think we both agree that this is not a resolution that is super complicated. I don't think we have to do a full-on history lesson, but having a few bullet points about where controversies over standardized tests come from is always good, helps you sound smart. Then we'll do the affirmative side of things with substantive arguments, the negative side, and then we will wrap up. So starting with starting with definitions, we'll go with colleges and universities. And so according to Webster, a simple definition would be institutions of post-secondary or higher learning providing facilities to grant academic degrees. I don't really think there's much of any room to sort of play with this one. I don't think there's any way to run crazy topicality. It's just very straightforward. I think anybody who tries to get clever with this is probably risking the judge kind of rolling their eyes and just like, no, I'm not interested.
Right, we're talking 2- and 4-year universities. There shouldn't be any argument that you can make to change that.
Yeah, I can't see that being a source of controversy. And we do try to look for like squirrely ways to define things, but I don't see one. So ought or more specifically, ought not. Now, I will say, and we may talk about this in a future video, the term ought can have a variety of complicated kind of philosophical meanings and moral implications. I don't think it does here, right? Because what we're basically saying is a fairly straightforward statement, which is we're using ought not, right, together. And we're basically, ought generally refers to advisability or obligation. So it is not advisable, and we are obliged not to use these things in admissions decisions. It's just not very complicated. Sometimes we get into these things about ought implies can. I don't think any of that matters here. I think it's fairly straightforward. Colleges and universities should not do X. That's what we're saying when we mean when we say ought. Now, having said that, I think we get into the two definitions that have maybe a little bit of room for discussion, and those are consider and then, much more importantly, standardized tests. So consider, the best definition, there are actually a lot of different meanings of that word if you think about it, but the best dictionary definition that I've found is to give attention to a particular subject or fact when judging something else, and that comes from the Cambridge Dictionary. So in other words, if you give attention to something, you consider it. And this is important, I think, because it's really important for the negative. Right? This is a very important word in the negative, because I do think this resolution, in terms of the substance of it, is weighted toward the affirmative. We're having a huge debate in society right now with all of these publications talking about how, maybe it's time to get rid of standardized tests, right? And I think the weight of the sort of momentum of the evidence is going toward the affirmative. The negative's strong response to that is, look, we don't have to show you that these standardized tests are perfect or that they're even good in the way that they're currently done. We don't have to advocate for them to have any particular weight or to be done the current way they're done in the status quo. All we have to show you, the negative should emphasize, is that they should be considered, right?
Right. You can argue that they can be considered differently, and that would be a very strong position to take. But consider, as written in the resolution, is virtually an absolute. That says ACT, SAT, AP tests, all of that goes out the window and can't even be asked for by a college.
Yeah, and if I'm the negative, I'll tell you, one thing that I'm hammering throughout the entire round is, Judge, I don't have to prove to you that these things are great. I can advocate for looking at them in a different way than we currently do, and we're definitely going to talk about that later, right? I can advocate for giving them a different weight than they currently have. Maybe I could advocate for only using them in cases where they help marginalized groups. I could do all kinds of things, as long as at the end of the round, you don't believe that we just chuck them out the window. You don't believe, if you really want to put a fine point on it, if you think your opponent's going to get a little bit squirrely with it, to literally say, is there a blank in the application for it or not, right? Whether it's mandatory, optional, it can be any of those things. If there is an opportunity anywhere in the process to look at these things, then the negative should win. And that's a big help for the negative on an otherwise kind of uphill fight, I think.
Right, and there's very limited evidence on what that would look like, because only one college in the United States, to my knowledge, refuses to accept standardized tests. And it's a very new phenomenon. The one thing they did find is that it did increase diversity. So that might be something to talk about if you're taking that angle as the affirmative.
Meanwhile, there are over 1,000 colleges and universities that have made it test optional. So one thing we're going to talk about later is test optional, right? In other words, you can, but you don't have to submit tests. Is that potentially negative ground for like a counterplan? In other words, let's not get rid of them entirely. Let's make them optional. Could that be a negative ground? I think it could.
And that's also something that's been found to increase diversity.
Yeah, maybe not as much, but it becomes a balancing, right? So the negative does not have to defend the status quo. I think is very clear. There's always arguments about that, like theory arguments, but I don't think you have to, just based on logic and common sense. So the big one is going to be standardized tests. Okay, this has to be interpreted. Let's just start with the fairly easy stuff, and then we can get into some thoughts that we have about may complicate this. So the easy stuff is, I think clearly in the context of a resolution that talks about college admissions, there are some things we can rule out. We are not talking about standardized tests that are used for grade level tests. Like in certain states, most states, right? If you're in a public school, there's going to be a mandatory test in math and English and science and whatever at the, like the 8th grade, 3rd grade, 10th grade, whatever, right? That you have to take. Those are almost never used in college admissions to begin with, because they're not, first of all, in most cases, they're years ago. They're not really about summing up your skills. But secondly, they're just not, right? And so you could have somebody come into a round and get confused and run a bunch of arguments about how, standardized tests are eating up all of our class time and leading to teaching of the test. That's a different kind of standardized test, right? And I think it's important that you remember the context of colleges and universities are considering it in their admissions decision. What we're really talking about here, if we want to be blunt, if you're just asking like what was the NSDA thinking, they were thinking the SAT and the ACT, right? And I would almost say that if you want a straightforward round, rather than trying to find a definition of like the term standardized test from a dictionary, you just say what we're talking about here is the SAT and the ACT.
But if you want to get squirrely with it, there are some angles that can be taken with AP test, or the one that I just thought of a few minutes ago.
Yeah, like just 5 minutes ago.
ASVAB. Because to enlist in the military or to go to a military institution, you have to have a certain qualifying score on the Armed Services Vocational Battery, which is the ASVAB.
Right.
So if your neg, I see that as the perfect way, open and shut, to say, that's a standardized test. The U.S. military uses it. Are we really ready to tell the United States military they have to reevaluate who can enlist?
So let me just back up and just say, okay, so like right from the beginning, Alicia's not making that up, right? So for example, if you want a definition, like a working practical definition of what standardized tests are for admission purposes, the Department of Education's Office of Federal Student Aid actually has a website about like what are the standardized tests used in college admissions decisions. And of course, at the top of the page, they've got the SAT and the ACT. But then after that, they list, as Alicia just said, AP exams. The CLEP, the CLEP test, right? The International Baccalaureate exam. These are all standardized tests that are used. They're mostly about college credit. Obviously, I know a lot of you guys are in AP classes. You're getting ready in some cases maybe for an AP exam. They're mostly about credit, but let's be honest, they're also considered in admissions. If you have a ton of AP classes on there and you aced your AP exam, you got like whatever, it's a 5 or whatever it is now, a perfect score, of course that's going to be considered in admissions decisions. And so if you come in and you say, like, is it a squirrel case? Absolutely. But if you come in and say, hey, if a kid works hard and, at a disadvantaged school and takes a bunch of AP classes and gets credit, why shouldn't they have that considered? Shouldn't that be part of their portfolio? I mean, I hate to tell you folks, but these tests absolutely are considered standardized tests in every sense. If you Google them, they will absolutely tell you AP exam, International Baccalaureate, those are all standardized tests. So in theory, you could run this sort of squirrely argument that says, we don't really care about SAT and ACT. Fine, get rid of those if you want to. We're not even going to talk about that. We're going to talk about whether a student from an urban high school should be able to put his hard-won AP scores on his exam, on his application. And then Alicia's even better, ASVAB, which is for admission to like service academies and things like that. If you really want to get squirrely, there's that. So I don't know that everybody, I don't think this is going to be common, but you might want to think of some responses on this, because if you go in and assume we're only ever talking about SAT and ACT, and you don't have like a theoretical reason why you can limit the debate to that, and you run into somebody who does something a little crazy, what are you going to say, right? So that's important. And then lastly, I guess I would say, undergraduate admissions decisions, pretty straightforward. Undergraduate refers to seeking either an associate's or a bachelor's degree. So we're not talking about like the LSAT for law school or the MCAT for med school or things like that. We're just talking about stuff for undergraduate. I don't think that's very difficult, but those, did we miss anything on definitions?
I think we're good on definitions, so just moving into values and criteria. So
values and criteria. And so Alicia, despite being super, super brilliant, is not a LD debater first. She's a Truman Scholar, and I know she doesn't want me to say that, but she's like super brilliant, but she's not an LD. So I'm going to do a little bit of the work on the values and the criteria. So on the affirmative, as I have said many times in these LD videos, I do not see any reason to overcomplicate things with your values. I rarely think you get a lot of value out of no pun intended, but I rarely think you get a lot of traction out of a super crazy esoteric value. So for example, I think the two big ones that you look at on the affirmative are probably justice and morality. Justice being giving each their due. That is to say, the way I would frame it would be, when you talk about giving each person their due, that being what justice means, you would say you're sort of due what you have earned in terms of your in terms of over your entire high school career. You are due to have that considered, right? You're due to be judged based on your whole record, not how you did on one day. And you're certainly due not having a racially biased test, to have to be judged based on, fair, non-biased criteria. And so this is very much about justice, having fair standards, having complete standards for how we make these decisions. I think it's a perfectly good value. And justice is one where it's hard to say justice isn't important, right? Morality, this may be a good one because it uses ought, and there's a lot of arguments that ought implies a moral standard. This is sort of frequently associated with moral obligations in philosophical literature. Now, you could go for other things. You could talk about a value of equality because of the bias issues. You could talk about a value of human dignity because of the bias and reducing a person to a test score. So there's a lot of options, but just remember, the purpose of a value is not to be tricky. It's to link your case up, to link a chain up to some high standard that nobody, no judge, no nobody, can say, I wonder why that matters, right? The point of the value is to be the ultimate lodestar, or everybody can agree that if you achieve that, yes, that is a good thing. So it's not really a place to be super creative. Be creative somewhere else in the case. As far as the criterion on the affirmative, I am a big fan. I'm always a big fan of Rawls. I know Rawls is a little old-fashioned, but in this case, Rawls, a lot of people use like the sort of standard formulation of Rawlsian justice, which is sort of like the veil of ignorance and distributive justice. You can use that here, but there's actually a better formulation in Rawls's theory, which is Rawls's theory of justice as fairness. Right? And so Rawls actually talks about like, when is it okay for us to allocate advantages differently in society? And clearly, like when we're talking about college admissions, it's an advantage that's being allocated, right? I mean, it's a zero-sum game. One person gets into school X and other people don't, right? There's only so many spots to go around. And so that's sort of a perfect fit with Rawls's talk when Rawls is talking about, well, how do we allocate these scarce resources if there's going to be inequality? And he says there has to be two things. First of all, there has to be true equality of opportunity to attain them, not just like formal equality, but like real meaningful equality, right? There's actually a fair chance for people who come from the highborn and the lowborn and everyone in between, you know, to get in there and attain them. And secondly, he says, and this kind of goes to his usual thing about distributive justice, any discrepancies have to contribute to the greatest benefit for the least advantage in society, right? And you can prefer this standard because, if you're arguing in the round, Judge, you can prefer this standard because it addresses the exact question here, which is allocating limited resources within society and how we do that. So, and we're going to link to a really good Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy article on this. It has some good stuff. By the way, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is really good. They don't dumb things down, but they do sort of simplify the language and try to avoid a lot of the really difficult curlicues that you see in philosophical stuff. So if that's not a place that you go to read up periodically, it should be. It's really good. So anyway, those are my thoughts on the affirmative side. On the negative side, again, on the values, you absolutely can use justice because justice is what everyone is due. And we're going to talk later on about how there actually are some decent arguments about how these tests maybe aren't as bad as you think, and they do give people what they're due. And you can just have a straight ahead fight on that, right? But there are also a couple of other options. One option would be autonomy, right? So, for example, giving people autonomy over whether their scores are considered. This would be a good value if you were going to run a counterplan of making tests optional, right? Of allowing people, which is, again, there's 1,000 schools in the country, including more and more prestigious schools that do this. If you were going to run a case like that, giving people autonomy and saying, look, you ought to have control over whether you submit these scores to a college. It shouldn't be the strong negative would be to simply advocate for test optional approaches in which these scores aren't required, but you can submit them if they choose. And autonomy is a really good value that has a lot of literature out there about how, if you don't respect the autonomy of the individual, that leads to all sorts that not respecting autonomy of human beings leads to all the worst things in the world. That's how we start dehumanizing people, which leads to bad stuff. And the other one is just utilitarianism, right? We're going to talk in a little bit about how maximizing overall good, about how these tests, at least arguably, or at least some version of these tests, whether it's test optional or whatever, right, lead to more accurate predictions of who will do well in college and who will not do well in college. That's going to lead to better outcomes for society. And if we can show that there's no racial bias, there's no downside, right, then we're doing a net good with no harm. So utilitarianism is kind of going to be, you're going to see a lot of people running utilitarianism. If you do run utilitarianism, there is a nifty theory that not a lot of people, you may have read it, but you may not. It's Harsanyi's theory of preference utilitarianism. And Harsanyi is as a philosopher, a 20th century philosopher, and he talks about like kind of updating theories of utilitarianism. And he doesn't spend a ton of time talking about this, but one thing he says is that like if you're going to do utilitarianism, you should be preferring outcomes that you would choose if you had all the relevant factual information. In other words, he talks about how you do utilitarianism through a lens of like having all the relevant information, and you would argue that like to have all the relevant information, you need to let people submit everything, including their standardized test scores. More information is good, right? In terms of frameworks and observations, I don't think that there's a ton of like crazy theory arguments to have here. I really do think that the main thing that's probably going to come up is like, what is the role of counterplans, right? If I'm the affirmative, I might want to prepare some kind of argument that suggests the negative, then there's standard arguments about this, but like the negative can't come in and just like make up a state of the world where standardized tests are done differently and where they're done perfectly. And there are theory arguments out there that we don't have time to go over about how that's just kind of generally unfair. If the negative can come in and sort of make up, at least in Lincoln Douglas's value debate, if the negative can come in and number one, make up an imaginary state of the world, and then two, tell you as the judge you can wave your magic wand of Judge Fiat and bring it into being, that's just too much power. That's like Thanos level power in Infinity War. Like, you shouldn't let them do that. So now without that, let's move on and talk a little bit about kind of the background and the history before we move to the specific argument. Okay, so next, let's talk a little bit about context. We're big believers that when you go into a debate round, in addition to the stuff that you have in your contentions and your blocks and the technical stuff, it always pays to have an understanding of the background and the context. And we don't have enough time to like do a full history lesson, but you're always going to be better off. You're always going to seem smarter if you can just have an understanding. You can say, in cross-examination and rebuttal, hold on, there's one thing you don't understand, which is if you look back in the 1970s, that kind of stuff. Judges love it when you seem like an erudite, smart person, especially, sort of community and lay judges, but even flow judges, they may not admit it, but deep in their heart of hearts, if they feel more confident that you're an educated person and not kind of making a fool of their ballot, they'll vote for you. So what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about the history of standardized admissions testing. And it's a super racist history. But then again, like a lot of history is super racist, as we were just talking about a second ago. So it all kind of began back in 1923 with a guy named Carl Campbell Brigham, who was a Princeton psychologist, and he publishes this book called A Study of American Intelligence. He takes these Army intelligence tests and he basically uses the data to conclude that non-white students, Jewish people, Italians, African Americans, were what he called ineducable. And it gets worse than that. Like in the book, he literally calls people morons and he says there's no point in spending money trying to educate people who are not white. It's really bad. It's so bad, as we were talking about a second ago, it actually gets parodied in The Great Gatsby. Like if you read The Great Gatsby, there's a part of the book where they're making fun of this guy for being super racist, even by the standards of the 1920s. So I thought that was interesting. And then, lo and behold, just a few years later, this same guy, Brigham, is chosen to create a new standardized admissions test called the SAT that was based largely on the same Army test that he cited before. It has all the same flaws. An elite group of colleges is called the College Board. They're trying to formulate a more consistent method of admissions. Now, to be fair, to their credit, one reason they're trying to do that is to sort of improve diversity by having kind of a standardized test rather than the very old system, which was they just sort of know your family and they know your prospects and you come from a good family with a lot of money. So there was an effort to do that. And to be honest, it did improve diversity in some respects. For example, you saw more Jewish applicants, Catholic applicants. Basically, that's what diversity meant in the 1920s, which was white men, right? But some of them are Jewish and some of them are Catholic. And you saw more of that. So that was good. And then basically, I'm not going to go through all of this, but as you see, it sort of expanded outward. It's made mandatory for Harvard applicants. It spreads throughout the Ivy League. It starts spreading throughout the country. And then in 1959, after the SAT has gotten over 500,000 people taking it every year, the ACT is founded kind of as a competitor using a test from out in Iowa, right? A test that was used for sort of a talent search. Now, this actually is an interesting, caveat. It doesn't mean much for your debating, but this is kind of why SAT and ACT kind of exist in parallel. Many of you will take both, right? I took both. Did you take both?
I took both.
Okay. A lot of people will take both, but the SAT tends to be more popular on the coasts. Like you've got your Ivy Leagues, but also just other coastal colleges on the Northeast. And then in California, it tends to be more popular. And because it's from Iowa, ACT tends to be super popular in the middle of the country. So I can tell you here at Mississippi State, when we talk with like our dean of students and we talk about standardized tests, the first thing that comes out of that is ACT, right? Are there people here who took the SAT? Of course, but it's the big one. So just a little bit of trivia there. And then just to make a long story short, over the course of the 1990s and the early 2000s, what you saw is SAT and ACT were getting a lot of criticism. Like people were pointing out racial disparities, people were pointing out socioeconomic disparities, people were pointing out, the kind of irrelevance of some of like the regatta thing I mentioned earlier, questions that just didn't speak to people's like experience and things like that. And they started this very long process of trying to sort of change things up. And in 2001, there was kind of a bombshell when the president of the University of California, Richard Atkinson, said, hey, y'all, I just want to let you know, I'm kind of thinking about like not having the SAT as a requirement. And back in 2001, this was a huge thing. This was like a huge shot across the bow, right? When the president of the University of Cal, the largest university system in the country, I believe, says, we're thinking about not using you. And so in response to that, SAT and to a certain extent ACT kind of start another round of trying to reform. This was back when the SAT added a writing section and they bumped the maximum score up from 1,600 to 2,400. So if you've got like much older siblings or friends or something who have SAT scores of like 2,200 and you're like, how did you do that? That's how, right? We came back to the old scoring in 2016. And then, the status quo today, really what you're seeing is that many colleges and universities are moving to a standardized test optional approach. Like when I at working university look at this Chronicle of Higher Education, we frequently see more and more institutions, prestigious schools all over the place, making these things optional. It's 25% of all the institutions in the country have it as optional now, and over 40% of top tier liberal arts colleges. And yet, 80% of all applicants at these schools still submit the tests scores because they know they're still going to be considered, right? So, that's kind of the history. Having kind of set that forth, I think it's kind of important to kind of set the table about like what the real world argument is here. We're going to get into the debate world argument in just a second, but it's important that we kind of frame like what the basic like real world arguments are. So we're in a world right now where criticism of standardized tests is huge. You see it in publications all over the place. Popular publications, academic literature, trade publications in the higher ed space, right? And there's I've been able to find 5 basic criticisms, right? And here's how they go. Number 1, standardized tests add cost, right? They add one more thing to pay for and do. And if you don't have any benefits, then adding cost is bad, right? If they're not doing anything good, then adding a small amount of cost is bad. Do you remember how much it costs to take one of these things? Do you have any idea?
I think it was about $100, but you also had to pay for the amount of scores that you sent beyond, I think, 5 free ones.
So you're talking about like an amount of money that's not huge, but it's not trivial, and then you have to pay to send more scores. And of course, as we'll talk about later, if you want to be competitive, you've got like costs of prep classes and things like that a lot of people take. So that's cost. The second one is that it's unnecessary, and this is going to get into the statistics, but like basically, if the purpose of the SAT and the ACT is to predict how well you're doing in college, how much prediction can you do just using high school GPA alone, right?
Real quick, the newest number on the ACT is $50 without writing, $70 with.
Okay, so just 50
I guess
to
I was thinking SAT or AP classes.
So not super expensive. But again, if something is not doing any good, or if it's doing a small amount of harm, right, then $50 is $50 wasted. It adds up to millions and millions of dollars.
Especially if you take it multiple times, which is something that higher income students are more able to do than lower income ones.
And conversely, if you're lower income, even if you take it once, it's a bigger impact for you. Like $50 can be significant for some folks, right? We need to be clear about that. But basically, if you can predict college success based on other factors like your GPA, then isn't it superfluous at best and potentially distorting, right, the outcome at worst? So that's the necessity argument. I'm separating the bias arguments into 2 things because I think they work a little bit differently. But the first one is like a pro-wealth or socioeconomic bias. And the way I phrase this, I like to use simple language that judges can remember. I just say it's one more opportunity for rich people to buy advantages, right? Through tutoring, through classes, through prep
books,
prep books, things like that, and that kind of stuff. Also, more affluent high schools tend to have
test prep courses.
Either test prep courses. That's one thing, or they just weave in things like verbal analogies more into the curriculum because, like at a private school, they understand that parents want their kids to have these high scores, right? And what this does is instead of having those advantages magnified once, like in just the GPA and things like that, now they're magnified twice through a standardized test, right? And then the second one would be racial and gender biases, which is just that you have lower scores for non-white students and women. That will hurt their admissions chances. And there may be so you're going to talk about later, there may be inherent, not only are the scores lower and does that hurt these groups, but there are arguments that like the way the test is structured, like there are biases inherent in the way the tests are administered. Am I getting that right?
Absolutely.
And then the last thing that I don't think is talked about nearly enough, it may not be like a full contention kind of thing, but these are high risk, all or nothing assessments. Like in the world of statistics, when we make predictions, we want to have a big data set, right? We want to look at a lot of different data points and make a good prediction. And your entire college history, you know, your GPA, your extracurriculars presents a really good, big, broad data set about how good a student you are. The SAT and the ACT are how well you did on one Saturday morning in 3 hours.
Which I will say, like, if I wanted to refute him, you can take the ACT up to 12 times.
Refute me, please.
With the SAT, you can take it, I don't even remember how many times, but I imagine it's somewhere more than 5. So in both of these, if you're a high-income student and have the disposable income to take the test as many times as you need to, that's something that gives you even more advantages and makes it less high stakes than it is for lower income students or those who have logistical challenges even just getting to the testing center.
I will tell you, I came from a middle class background in a rural high school in Mississippi, and this was back in the 1990s, late 90s, so it's a little bit different. But like, you know, for me, taking the SAT and the ACT was a matter of my mom saying, oh, by the way, tomorrow you're going to go over to this college and sit down and take a test. There was no preparation. I had no idea what was going on. And so I went and I took it, and thank goodness, you know, it went fairly well, but, you know, it might not have, right? And it doesn't for a lot of people. So I think the idea of it being a high risk, all or nothing thing is kind of an issue. So if that's the case, if we have all these objections, then like the question would be, why do we want standardized tests at all? And the basic core answer, and you need to be able to explain this, especially if you're the negative, you have to tell a story about why these things are good. Why is it not just one more waste of time? And the basic reason is we think it's important that people get into the right college that fits them. Like that the quote, right people, and you got to be careful with that, get into the right college, right? And that we believe that these tests help us do a better job of predicting who is going to be well suited for a particular college. And I would submit that if you can't defend some version of that argument, then you probably can't win as the negative, right?
Right. The go-to stock argument for this is that this is an objectivity measure. It's an objective measuring stick that differentiates between good and bad schools and between lenient and tough graders, all sorts of different factors. It gives you an apples-to-apples comparison regardless of what the curriculum is. And
that's sort of like what we're saying here. I have a little slide here, and it basically says, so if that's the case, if we have these two things, it's important that the right people get in, right, and that we think these tests do it. So first of all, why is it important that the right people get in? And there's kind of two reasons for that. One is fairness. If you've worked hard and done well in high school, we think that should be rewarded. Okay, fair enough. The other thing is avoiding mismatch, right? Which is to say that if you admit someone who's not yet prepared at the level of, say, a rigorous college, and they get in, it can hurt them, right? And as someone who works in higher ed, I can tell you, there are cases where students get in, they're unprepared, they spend a bunch of money, they take out a bunch of loans, they're not ready for college, and they end up, you know, either failing out or dropping out. And then what do they have? They have no degree, they have a lot of loans. So, you know, there are statistical arguments about that, but that is a story that I think you have to be able to tell, that, you know, it's not just a case where you get into the college and everything's good from then on. If you're letting in folks who are not a good fit, who can't handle the rigor, then it can be bad, not just for the person who got non-admitted, but also for the person who got admitted and wasn't quite ready for it. Now, there's a lot of criticism of that theory, and we're going to talk about it later, but that's the theory, right? You need to understand. And so the question would be, how does standardized test help with that? Well, as Alicia pointed out, number one, it's an apples-to-apples comparison. And later on, we're going to talk about how high schools do grade inflation. I mean, goodness knows, most of you guys probably, and girls, most of you probably have GPAs over 4.0. I hate to say that. Maybe not most, but a lot of you probably do. And that's because high schools assign higher grades, and within the courses, the teachers bump things up. There is grade inflation, and you need an apples-to-apples objective comparison, right, that says, how good is this person versus how good is that person? And then the last point is the idea that these tests help us predict success in college, that they give us additional information to help us make more accurate predictions of like who's going to do well in college. So, you know, I think that those are sort of the basic narratives that we have. The AF is saying we don't need standardized tests for accurate admissions. You know, they cause harm, whether they're big or small. They have almost non-existent benefits and significant cost, and the world's better without them. And the next basic story is, look, standardized tests aren't perfect, but they don't cause all these problems. They're not the reason why you see, for example, racial bias. That's due to bigger problems in society, and sometimes they're very helpful. And plus, we don't have to show you that they're good. We just have to show you that they shouldn't be completely disregarded, right?
One thing I'd like to say before I forget it is when you're making the case about whether the test predicts success in college, I think you need to make a very careful distinction between future college GPA and just being at the level where you can stay in college.
Yeah.
Because honestly, the purpose of the ACT is to make sure that you're not getting into college when you're not adequately prepared. It's not there to tell you if you're going to be an A, B, C, D student, because the fact is college is a lot harder than high school, and it all depends on your program and your professors and your work ethic.
Yeah.
So that's a distinction to make, because that's going to be coming up on the app side.
So if I'm the negative and the app says, oh, well, excuse me, if I'm the affirmative and the negative says, oh, well, these tests, they do such a good job at predicting GPA, my response would be, why do I care? If I'm admitting someone from a disadvantaged socioeconomic background and they're getting in, right, and they're struggling, they're working hard, they came from a high school that's maybe not as rigorous, and they work hard, and maybe they get C's. But you know what? They graduate from Harvard, or they graduate from, Princeton or wherever, right? And they have that degree. Haven't I done a good thing?
Well, and my understanding of the evidence also is actually that the link between standardized tests and college GPAs and between high school GPAs and college GPAs is relatively weak. But you, as the negative, want to say, that doesn't matter, because the purpose is not to predict GPA, because GPA is not the objective metric of success. It's like, are you prepared and will you graduate?
Yep.
And what we see is that when that's the measuring stick, both GPA and standardized tests are very good predictors, and then together, they're really good predictors.
Okay. So next we will get to the part you've all been waiting for, which is where we actually talk about contention level stuff on the affirmative and then later on the negative. Okay, so we're going to start off with the affirmative, the part that you've all been waiting for, the substantive arguments. And I think what we'll do is we'll kind of just go through kind of ascending order. Like, we'll start with some of the smaller arguments, some of the things that you shouldn't ignore, the things that might not be the hugest impacts. And then we'll just kind of build our way up to the stuff that everybody's going to be running, things like, racial bias and that sort of thing. So, at the most basic level, I think one of the things I'm interested in is just the cost of administering these tests, right? They're not free. So, for example, they add millions of dollars to the overall cost of college admissions. So there's this article from Princeton Review, and the founder of the Princeton Review, which is like this test prep group, and he says, back in 2014, that SAT and ACT add over $500 million a year to the cost of applying for college. Well, unless you've got some significant benefits to accuracy, like that number alone, $500 million a year, unless you can show me something, what I would say is like, what are we buying for our $500 million a year in terms of increased accuracy? It better be something pretty tangible. It better not be like a 1 or 2% gain, which hint, is exactly what it is, right? They pay, you can talk for, this is not exactly an impact, but it is a good context. You can talk about how they pay their CEOs these high six-figure salaries and they generate big profits, and, they're not really very useful for most of the people taking them. He says that he believes that only about 800,000 students who are heading to selective schools, right, are really going to have these test scores matter. Like, if you're starting out at a community college, it really does not matter at all. If you're starting out at many state schools, it doesn't matter very much. And he says if you divide the total cost by those 800,000 students, it's like for every student that gets any value out of it, there's a $1,200 cost. That doesn't mean people are paying $1,200, but it means for everybody for whom the test has any value in getting them to the correct school, for whom it matters, it's $1,200 a person, right? And so that's one. And I would say, in addition to that, I think we said earlier that it's $50 just to take the test. I saw that like Princeton Review has a $600 course for prep, and then a $1,000 course. And those are kind of, frankly, Princeton Review is kind of it's not like Walmart, but it's like the Target. It's like the Target of test prep. There are plenty of people out there who are like, specific individual test prep people who will charge you $10,000 to get ready for it. Did you do any of those courses?
I had a little Italian man named Dr. Acosta, but he didn't cost that much, but he came in and did ACT and SAT prep.
Yeah, she comes from an extremely privileged family. They have some photos of them on their yacht out of...
We don't have a yacht.
Okay,
we have a 22-foot bay boat.
But they were off the coast of Maine. I saw it was really lovely. But anyway, but so it gets expensive, right? And so one thing I would not sleep on the cost argument. I wouldn't ignore it. Is it as big as racial disparity? No, but there's two reasons why I think it's important. First of all, it is an absolute deadweight loss, right? If you can show that standardized tests aren't adding much in terms of like actual predictive value, this is a concrete number that you can point to, and you say, look, we're not getting anything for this money, right? And it's just complete deadweight loss. and that's measurable in ways that maybe some of the other problems on this are not measurable. $500 million is probably about as concrete a statistic as you're going to see, on this topic. And then the second is that it kind of dovetails with socioeconomic bias. Like, let's be honest, for a lot of you folks out there, $50 for your family is not a big deal, right? It's not. But $50 is a significant amount of money for low-income families. Just dropping $50 here and there is something they can't do. And you can be darn sure that if you want to try to be competitive on these tests, a $1,000 prep course, right, would be absolutely something that would be, a big challenge. And, if your opponent sort of, minimizes this and says, oh, it's not a big deal, well, that's great. You can absolutely say, look, see, this privilege, this assuming that $1,000 doesn't matter. I do think cost, though, is a good place to start. So, that's one thing. But where we start getting into, I think, more of the meat of it is on ineffectiveness, right? When we talk about whether or not these tests actually do what they're supposed to do. And I think one thing that the affirmative is going to basically argue is like, these tests don't do a good job. They don't add much value in predicting, whether you're ready for college and whether you'll succeed in college. And remember, as we said earlier, I think at the end of the day, like the only possible justification for standardized tests is they help us predict who belongs where in a way that helps everybody get to a college that's a good fit for them. If they don't do that, then we should not have them, right? And I think this is really important. So it depends, like there are different statistics that you can go with here. Some are a little bit more rigorous and conservative, and some are a little bit more aggressive. Like I found this one from Lonnie Guinier of Harvard and back in 2015, and she basically says that only 2.7% of the grade variance in the first year college student can be effectively predicted by the SAT, which what that means in layman's terms is that 97.3% of the time, right, these tests are either unnecessary, like the high school GPA would have done the work for you, the high school GPA would have predicted it, or they're wrong, right? They predict incorrectly what your GPA would be. So if they're only useful in 2.7% of cases, the argument would be we're paying too high a cost for it.
And the counterpoint there is that you say that the objective purpose of having a standardized test is not to determine what your GPA will be. I don't think anyone has actually made the argument that a standardized test should decide what GPA you'll have in college. It's more, are you going to get in college and ultimately graduate?
But are they better at that or worse at that, right? In other words, are they better at predicting whether you graduate or worse at predicting graduation?
And actually just found a study on that. Utah State University in 2017 found that out of all the factors that they looked at, which was GPA, extracurricular involvement, ACT and SAT, they found that ACT English and ACT Math were the only significant predictors to college graduation.
Okay, so we'll definitely drop that in the notes below. That would actually be a good negative point. Because, yeah, that's true. I mean, GPA is kind of important, but what's much more important is do you get the degree, right? And so we'll want to focus on that. There are other statistics that you can look at in addition. I think probably better than the statistics from Lonnie Guinier is the 2001 study from the University of California system that is sort of a longitudinal study that found that SAT scores predict only 13.3% of college first year grades, and that actually makes them worse at predicting those, even if you assume those grades matter. Like if you could say maybe they don't, maybe all that matters is graduation, but if you assume they matter, right, the SAT predicts them 13.3% of the time. High school GPA predicts it 15.4% of the time. And this California study by Geiser and Studley, is generally considered a pretty good one. It's one of the larger sort of longitudinal, really well-established studies. It is a little bit dated, right? But it establishes, I think there's a very strong consensus in the literature that high school GPA does a slightly better job than SAT, ACT.
And I think slightly is an important qualifier there, because if it's only 15% accurate, or 13 to 15% accurate at predicting your GPA, then neither is a good metric.
Fair enough, but I guess the argument would be if you're the app to say, look, I mean, nothing's perfect, right? Nothing's ever going to be perfect. We've got to make a decision, right? And we should pick whichever one is less bad. And now, to be clear, what the negative is going to say is you actually don't have to pick one. You should do both, you should look at both together, right? But if we're talking in the world of picking one over the other, 15.4 is higher than 13.3. You know, that would sort of be the argument. But yes, but anyway, summing up, we'll put this in the notes. There's a study from Atkinson and Geiser 2009, and it just says, quote, irrespective of the quality or type of school attended, cumulative grade point average in academic subjects in high school has proven consistently to be the best overall predictor of student performance in college. This finding has been confirmed in hundreds of predictive validity studies conducted over the years, including studies conducted by the testing agencies themselves, plus others like Morgan 1989 and Burton and Ramis 2001. So basically, you know, I do think you can amass a lot of literature if you want, saying, look, high school GPA does a better job, so why do we need these tests to begin with, right? So that's kind of my thoughts on in terms of like effectiveness. Did we have anything else we need to cover on that?
I think we're good on that.
Okay, so on socioeconomic bias, I want to talk a little bit about, you know, before we get to sort of racial and gender bias, socioeconomic bias is a major issue I think that the AF needs to talk about. And that really there's a ton of data, I mean just an absolute ton, that talks about how standardized tests reflect wealth a lot more and a lot better than they reflect your actual performance in college, right? And so, for example, there is data that is actually released by the College Board, and we'll drop links to where this is summarized, but this data comes straight from the actual test scores collected by the College Board. In other words, they would have every incentive to say the opposite of this, right? But even they will admit, right, that SAT scores rise basically on a straight line in accordance with family income, right? For every, and this is not exact, so please don't quote me on this, but I'm just looking at the chart, and we'll put the chart in the links. But like for every additional roughly like $20,000 of annual family income, you're adding about 30 additional points. And this goes in a straight line. So for those of you who know statistics, if something is random, if there's no correlation, you would expect it to jump up and down, right? If there's a weak correlation, you would expect it to kind of go up and then go down a little and kind of go up. What this does is it's a straight line. The more money you make, the higher you do on these tests, right? And that is absolutely true across the board, and it goes even higher when you get up to the really high incomes, like over $200,000. And then in addition to that, there's plenty of evidence that test prep, which can be very expensive, raises scores. And, you know, as I said earlier, I would refer to it as buying better scores, right? I would refer to it in simple language that the judge can appreciate it. You're buying a better score, right? So I think, and there's more data on that, but I think it's important to emphasize, right? So the big one then, and the one we're going to spend the most time on, is sort of gender and racial biases, right, in the test itself. And I think you've really got to get ready to hunker down and get ready to fight on this. Alicia and I were talking earlier, and I think if you come into this and you have like one statistic that says there's a gender bias or there's a race bias, or one statistic on the other side, right? You're going to be in for a bad time, because I think the best debaters are really going to drill down and understand how this works and have the best studies that they can. So look, obviously there is a ton of evidence out there that both the SAT and the ACT reflect major score differentials that are adverse to African American students, Hispanic students, to a lesser extent to Native American students, and they're favorable to white students and Asians, right? And we will link to sources on that, but if you want an example, like you've got this Brookings Institution piece from 2017, where you say the mean score for the math section in the SAT for all test takers is 511 out of 800. The average score for African Americans is 428. For Latinos, it's 457. For whites, it's 534. And for Asians, it's 598. So we see clear discrepancies that are not attributable to just like random statistical variations. These things happen year in and year out. And then there are also, for example, arguments that we can make about how the tests themselves have structural issues that make them more biased. And I think you had a lot of good data about like why this is not an accident. This is in the test itself.
Right, so the way that tests are produced is you have a pre-testing phase first, where a set of questions gets added, often as an unscored portion, or with the case of the ACT, it's sent as a pilot test that's like a school-administered test. Now with these, the way they decide if a question is good or not is they look at a student's overall score on a test, and then they look at how that student does on each individual question. And students that are perceived as high ability students will score well on reliable questions. And students who overall on the test are ranked as having low ability are expected to do poorly on questions. And that's related to whether the question is easy, medium, or hard. So basically, if the correlation between how high ability students do on a particular question and their overall score falls below a certain threshold, and according to the Santa Clara Law Review, that threshold's usually about 0.30, it's flagged as an unreliable question and thrown out. So what that means is if a question is geared to help a minority group, because they are a minority, it's because they are basically a small portion of that overall sample size, they're going to be biased against. And white students, if a question is geared towards them, are going to have an advantage in that regard. It's just statistics.
Let me make sure I understand this. So are you saying this sort of Santa Clara Law Review article, is it saying essentially that basically there's a quality control process built into like the SAT that is going to affirmatively remove questions that help students that are in minority groups?
Yes, the process explicitly favors whoever's in the majority. So it's not meant to be a racialized thing, and it's not meant to favor one gender over the other.
But it doesn't have to.
But the net result is whichever group is bigger, like size-wise, and we already know that fewer students of color and fewer low-income students take the ACT and the SAT. So whichever group is bigger is going to be advantaged in the test, and it's a self-perpetuating cycle.
So for example, just being able to say, look, we know what's going to happen here, right? You're going to come in and you're going to say there are disparities, right? The negative is going to come in and say, no, the disparities are not in the test itself, right? The disparities are just in society. There are inequalities in society. There's systemic racism. There's historical underfunding of schools in certain areas that are predominantly minority. All these things. The tests aren't causing it. It's not the test's fault. And if you get rid of the test, that's not going to fix the problem. That's what the negative is going to say. And what you have to be able to do is to hit back and say, no, actually, there are fundamental problems in the test, and let me show you why. And so what Alicia's talking about here is saying, look, we can explain to you why the test itself is wired in terms of how it's created to reject questions that statistically help groups that are in the minority.
Right, so they gave a good example of this in this article. They took two 1998 SAT questions that were basically meant to serve the same purpose, and it showed you which one was ultimately chosen and which one wasn't. So one question, which was considered medium difficulty, was answered correctly by 62% of white students and 38% of African American students. On the other question that ultimately made it on the test, we see that African Americans answered 8% more correctly than white Americans, and that test was ultimately rejected.
And, you can kind of give a simple explanation of this by saying, you got to kind of explain those statistics, and you'd have to find a good little, money quote to put in your case. But you can kind of explain this in fairly simple terms by saying, look, these are called standardized tests for a reason, right? They're supposed to test what what the standard things that are taught to students are, right? And they don't have to be, you don't have to have racist people preparing them, right? What happens is if they are prepared and created and drafted in a way that favors the majority group, most people, whoever that is, right? If it's green people, it doesn't matter, right? Then that means that anything that sort of sticks out and anything that kind of frankly recognizes that there are cultural differences, right? If you hypothetically had a question that was more about something that maybe a Latino descended person in a Latino neighborhood understood, well, you don't have to be racist to understand that for white kids out in Iowa. By the way, hi, I know there's some of you watching, right? For white kids out in Iowa, that might be harder to answer, and they're going to look at that and say, oh, well, most people did badly. Yeah, because most people that are doing the test, during the preparation phase, are white, right? And so that's what's going to happen. And I think that's important. You also have other things. There's stuff from, for example, like Fair Test, and they are an anti-testing group. They have their biases, but they point out and will point you to, and I'll link to some of their stuff, but they will point to you to stuff about how the structure of these tests can be biased against women because of the formatting of standardized tests, about how multiple choice tests under a short time constraint with guessing penalties, right, are all factors that have been statistically shown to favor just and maybe this involves a gender stereotype, but it's an empirically supported one, typical male patterns of learning, right? Remember, this whole idea of standardized tests, like most stuff, that has problems, was invented by guys, right? It was administered by guys. It was evolved over the course of decades by guys. So it's not just that, any particular iteration of the test is bad. It's this whole idea of, multiple choice, short period of time, kind of like a game, like a video game, is something that is slightly biased in favor of just...
I would agree. I mean, it's well documented that women tend to be more risk averse. So on the SAT, if I didn't know a question, I skipped it. Whereas I would imagine some of my guy friends would have guessed on a question if they could narrow it down to 2 or even 3 of the choices, and that might benefit them.
Yeah, and so you talk about those sort of structural issues. Last thing I'm going to say on the app is there's a lot of room for critical theory arguments on this. I'm usually not a fan of critical theory arguments, but I will say that given sort of the racialized history of the SAT and given that it continues to have racial biases today, there is a strong argument that you should sort of say that you have to reject standardized tests to sort of reject this racial determinism, right? And sort of tear down this sort of white supremacist system, and the role of the ballot is to kind of reject these symbols of racism and these institutions of racism in society. I don't know that you need that. I think you could just make a straight policy argument that they're bad for people of color. But if you wanted to take a more critical approach, I do think this is the kind of case where even judges that are usually a little bit averse to kind of critical approaches would probably be okay with it, because there's a lot of really bad history, and today you still see the biases, and at some point you got to say that, like, defenders are going to say it's not racist, but at some point if it walks like a duck and it quacks, if it walks like a racist duck and it quacks like a racist duck, and at the beginning the people who created it said racist duck things, then it probably is a racist duck, whatever that is. And so, very last thing they have, a couple of arguments that I think are a little bit weak that I've seen bandied about are, number one, teaching to the test. I don't think this is a strong argument, because remember, we're not talking about standardized tests like to pass a grade. That definitely is a strong argument to like state standardized tests, but not so much for the ACT and SAT.
Even at my private school, we really didn't teach to the test.
Right. You don't spend a lot of time wasting class time or changing curriculum for the ACT and SAT. It's more like the state test. So don't get confused on that. And then the second thing is, some people say they help you learn more, and the answer is no, they don't. They don't help you learn more. I mean, it's just recapitulating things that you were supposed to have learned anyway. It's totally duplicating the things you learned before. The whole point of them is that you don't learn anything new, right? It's supposed to be stuff and skills and ideas that you learned before. So the idea that they're going to let you learn more, no, that's not the point. The point is to make you kind of do it again, right?
I guess it was the original Common Core. It's at the original standard, but it no longer plays that role. If anything, it's a lower bar than the one we're trying to seek today.
Right. So that is the AF, and then we'll scoot over and talk a little bit about the negative.
So now we're going to get into the negative, and this is arguably the harder side of the case, but personally I feel like it's the side I fall on, and I would imagine a lot of you also, just because it's such an intrinsic part of your life. But one thing I'd like to lead with is, on the negative side, you do not have to defend standardized tests as they exist today. You don't have to defend the ACT or the SAT in their current iterations. You could completely scrap those tests as we know them and replace them with a different test or a different configuration of those tests.
Now, you have to be a little careful, because we know that in different parts of the country, in different leagues, people have different attitudes about what you might call counterplans or counter-advocacies in Lincoln Douglas. But I think that there's a strong argument that in the real world that exists today, changes are happening. Like, colleges are going in droves, for example, to testing optional policies.
We also see the SAT adversity score as
Right.
something that's going to be taken on full scale in the next year.
So it's not, I don't think on this topic it is at all unreasonable for the negative to come in and say, I do not have to stand by the status quo, because the status quo is changing. Like, hundreds of schools every year are changing over to optional, the adversity score, things like that. Now, you might get into a kind of a theory debate if you're asking the judge to do a true counterplan and to like fiat the change, like you judge vote negative and the change happens. So you could get into that, but in terms of like whether you have to sort of go for like exactly what it's like today, I don't think you do.
But I mean, with the test optional and with the adversity score, you have the inherency that is already happening, and you have even some evidence behind you as to show why that would be a good thing if it was more universal. With that being said, jumping into arguments, the first one I would start with is that even if standardized testing is bad, it's still more fair to minority students than the alternative.
Yeah.
The first thing I come to is the natural alternative is GPA. But what we see, just from research from multiple sources, the first one being Michael Hurwitz and Jason Lee in their book, Measuring Success Testing Grades in the Future of College Admissions, what they found is they looked at longitudinal data from over 10-year period, and what they found is that grade inflation is greater among white, Asian, wealthy, and private school students than among less advantaged students and those in public schools. So GPA, we already know, has a differential across racial and socioeconomic lines, and it's getting worse as we go, as grade inflation increases.
And this is not just, I mean, yes, cite the sources, we'll drop them in the notes, but this is just common sense, and you can explain it to judges in a very common sense sort of way, which is this. I went to a public school. If my parents come in and say, back when I was in school, I don't like the grades grades that Brett got, you know what they say? We don't care, right? They have no incentive to inflate my grades. The teachers don't care. The principal certainly doesn't care because my parents aren't paying the bills. I mean, they're paying taxes, but they're not paying tuition. If you go down the street to the private school, as we were talking about earlier, you know.
Yeah, I went to one of those private schools.
But you didn't go to like one of the crazy, like rich, super rich ones, right?
No, I went to like a relatively average high school,
Yeah.
but we still had parents come in and say, quote, I am not paying for my child to get a B.
Right. When he who pays the piper calls the tune. And so it should be intuitive that we have this empirical research that says that grade inflation is bigger at private high schools. Private high schools tend to be predominantly white, predominantly middle to upper income, right? And that's certainly what they are. And they have an incentive to please their customers, and that's why grade inflation happens. So you need to have something that balances that out, that doesn't let the private schools of the world keep jacking their grades up through the roof, and that is what a standardized test is.
But we should note that it still happens in public schools as well.
Just not as much.
Right, not as much, but it still happens in wealthier, wider public schools. And there could be reasons for that. Everything from like publicly elected school boards, just to really troublesome PTA parents.
You know, frankly, if you associate whiteness with having greater income, which unfortunately that's the truth, right? That's and having greater social capital. If your parents come in and one of them is a lawyer and the other is an accountant, and they start badgering the teacher and the principal, no matter whether it's public or private, that's going to carry more threat than if your parents come in and their job is to be, you know, a cleaning person.
Or
you
if
know,
your parents don't have the time to go and complain to the school board.
Yeah, right, exactly. They got to go to work,
some
right?
parents work real jobs.
Yeah, exactly. So that's a really good point. And so I'm going to dovetail with that. I think that goes to a larger point that I have labeled as tests actually slightly help underrepresented groups rather than hurting them. And so there is this 2008 study that comes from Mattern et al. And I'll say right off the bat, it was published by the College Board, so I'm going to talk about that in a second. So there may be a conflict of interest, but it summarizes other previous studies too, right? And what it talks about is, and I think this is really important, if you compare ACT and SAT scores to college outcomes later, what you find is that they actually over-predict performance for members of marginalized groups, that is, low-income students and students of color. Now, are the predicted performances and the scores somewhat lower than wealthier students and white students? Yes, but in comparison to the actual outcomes, they actually over-predict. They predict that these students will do better than they would have otherwise done. And that's the question, right? This is the point the negative has to say. The question is not, are the scores lower? The question is, would the scores and would the profile that you submit to the college be better with or without the test? We know they're lower. We know that there are larger socioeconomic issues at play. There's systemic racism. There's historical racism. The question is not, does that exist? We all know it exists. The question is, if we take away the test, will it get better or worse? And what this study and the studies it cites says is that if these tests are over-predicting performance, they're actually painting a rosier picture of these applicants, lower income and people of color, right, than would be actually the case. So they're slightly helping them. Now, to be clear, this study, the 2008 study, was published by the College Board. You know, there is an accusation of bias there. It cites studies that were not published by the College Board, though. And also, it's numbers, right? It's data. It's not an opinion piece where Mattern is coming in and saying, here's what I think. You either believe the numbers or not. And so, for example, if I ever get called out on bias of a study in a round, I always say, this study is based on numbers. If you think there's something inaccurate in the numbers, please tell me what it is, right? Tell me where the data was bad or where the calculations were bad, but otherwise it's just numbers. It's not an opinion piece. It's either true or it's false. You either have evidence that it's true or it's false, or you don't, right? So that's sort of what I would say. Now,
the next point to talk about is, what's the alternative?
Right.
If we reject a relatively standardized metric, we're going to be rejecting it for something more subjective. And in many cases, that's something like interviews, extracurriculars, leadership. Like, what is leadership anyway? Is there an objective way of defining that? And what we see is that in all of those categories, racism in interviews is well documented in everything from jobs to college admissions and scholarships. Extracurriculars are classist because they require a lot of money to do travel ball or speech and debate or mock trial. And the same thing with just leadership involvement. Typically, that comes with having connections, and if you're a minority in your school,
and you don't have to work after school,
right?
You don't have a job,
that
right?
assumes you have the time to be in a typical leadership position, or things like community service. Do you have time to serve your community if you're just trying to get your family through?
This is the one from the Measuring Success article. Is that the one you're talking about?
Well, just a more general claim. I've got cards for it.
But anyway, I guess what I'm saying is, yes, there's common sense about it, but there's also statistical evidence out there about how the basic idea, and I think it was Measuring Success, which is the 2018, right? Which I think we will try to drop that in the notes. But basically, yes, I mean, the question, and if you're the negative, you focus on this, not are these scores lower, in disparities, but is it worse than the alternative, right? Is the alternative going to make it better or worse? If the alternative is interviews, extracurriculars, even this inflated high school GPA, in all cases, those are sort of soft, squishy, malleable, manipulable standards. And guess what, folks? In the real world, parents who are privileged, I mean, for goodness sake, look at the scandal with, what's her name from Full House, Lori Loughlin, right? People will do all kinds of crazy things to get their kids in school. And yes, of course, you're going to pay to get them on the sailing team, or in her case, to pretend to be on the sailing team or crew team or whatever, right? But, it's really just sort of common sense. It's also a historical fact. Right? If you look back in the 20th century, what you saw actually in like elite Ivy League schools was when Jewish applicants and Catholic applicants started doing better and getting in larger numbers, a lot of these previously kind of progressive, folks at Harvard and other places like, oh, whoa, we've got too many diverse people. We need to narrow it down. How are we going to do that?
Interviews.
Oh, yeah, interviews. This sort of, like holistic admissions process where we're going to talk about character and the whole person and that kind of thing. And of course that's manipulable, right? So, the basic question, and what we talk about is what would you look to? Like, if we got rid of this, what would you look to? High school GPA is going to be inflated. Extracurriculars are super expensive. Interviews are going to reflect bias. And in that study, didn't it talk about how, like, in employment decisions, when you do interviews as opposed to tests, it leads to more bias?
So this is from the Quarterly Journal of Economics. And basically what they did is, at a large retail company, they looked at 1,363 new hires. And some of those were hired by a traditional interview process, and some were hired by using a test. Like, if any of you have applied for internships, you might have taken one of those personality and basic reasoning kind of tests.
Right.
And what they found is that even though minorities did score lower than their white counterparts, there was no measurable impact on minority hiring gains, but retention was higher. So basically, you're hiring more qualified applicants, and you're still hiring the exact same number. And the reason is this eliminating a good bit of the bias, in the process.
Right. So that's not college admissions, but by analogy, what you say is it shouldn't be surprising that as between an objective race-blind measure, right, and a subjective interview in a world where we know that there's unconscious bias that everybody has, right, an objective measure, at least in the long run, is going to lead to a better outcome. And that's kind of what we're arguing about here, right? So the next point that I would make is, and this is so sort of generally speaking, right, we have these arguments that overall these tests don't harm, underrepresented groups. But in addition to that, there's sort of an individual kind of autonomy argument, which is to say, at least in some cases, individuals ought to have the freedom to submit these and at least make their argument. And this comes from a guy named, it's DeBoer 2018, and he's a very progressive dude. It's called the Progressive Case for the SAT. And he basically says, look, in a world where so much is working against impoverished and underrepresented minority students, a surprisingly high SAT or ACT might set them up to even the odds or even move them into the upper echelon. And he basically, as you said earlier, points to grade inflation at private schools that is not equaled at public schools. And he says that public school students, and particularly minority students, need to have this objective apples-to-apples comparison because basically mommy and daddy can't storm in and threaten to withdraw their tuition from St. Wellington's Country Day School, right? And so the idea being, both on a general level, it slightly helps people who are disadvantaged, but also on a specific level, you ought to have the freedom to try. You ought to have the right to try. Again, as Alicia said, we might change up the system and look at these tests differently, but you should not tell a student from, the Jackson Public Schools here in Mississippi would be an example, disadvantaged schools historically in many cases, unfortunately. You should not tell them, right, you got a 35 on the, or 34 or 35 35 or 36 on the ACT, but I'm sorry, we can't consider that. That's ridiculous. Now, maybe you weigh the test lower for the kid from St. Welthington's Country Day School. Maybe you say it doesn't really matter much because you had these advantages. But if the kid from the inner city school with one parent and a low income comes in with a 36, you got to look at it, right? You've got to look at it. It's a moral imperative. And that goes to autonomy, right? And I think you can argue that almost at an emotional level. Are you telling me that a kid who comes in with a 36 from so-and-so, impoverished urban high school cannot get that considered? That is ridiculous. Change it, amend it, alter how you do it, but do not fail to consider it. I think that's a strong
And I will say, do be careful with that, because if you're like a clearly privileged white kid walking in and I'm just really upset.
Don't be disingenuous.
Don't be dramatic about it.
But be forceful, but don't be over dramatic, right?
Right. So like with that, looking at some of those alternatives to the way that we deal with the test. One of the first that comes to mind for me that's really fascinating is states that require standardized testing. So Michigan is a good example. They require the ACT for all juniors in public schools. So what they found is that when they required students to take the ACT, they found an additional 480 college-ready low-income students out of every 1,000 just between the year before they had that policy and the year afterwards. So basically that's another 48% of students who are ready for college.
So by forcing people to take the tests, you kind of compel them to get ready for college, or you discover that they're
You discover that
Okay.
they're college ready, because in the current system, what happens is when you have those costs of taking the test and the logistical challenges, some students self-select out for whatever reason. When it's mandatory, though, you unearth students who are college ready, and that at the very least puts the impetus on them. You're ready. Are you going to take this opportunity?
I see. So kind of unearthing like diamonds in the rough.
Exactly.
Another option, I guess, appropriately would be, and I think this is really important, I do think this is going to come up because it's a real world issue, is testing optional policies. Okay, I think this is going to be a big deal on the negative side, and it has literature kind of on both sides of it, but like testing optional is the new trend in higher education. It is something where basically we say, of course you can submit these scores, we'll take them. You don't have to. And more, prestigious schools, mid-level schools, all kinds of schools are allowing this as a policy. And there was an April 2018 Inside Higher Ed article that summarized a 2018 study by Syverson, Franks, and Hiss. And we're going to link to this, both the study and the summary. And it basically said that testing optional policies were a major success, that they were improving diversity, and they were doing so without any cost to the overall quality of the class. So just the bullet points on this were, number one, in the years following the adoption of a testing optional policy, we saw increases in the total number of applications. We saw gains in the number of Black and Latino students applying and being admitted to these institutions. We saw underrepresented minority students were the ones who were more likely not to submit, right? But among these non-submitters, they were actually more likely than they previously were to get in. And most importantly, what it found is that the graduation rate stayed high, right? And that the overall quality of the class in terms of like GPA didn't go down. So the argument would be from, for example, the Syverson, Franks, and Hiss thing is like, look, testing optional is working, right? Testing optional is improving diversity, right? It is leading to just as good a quality of the class. So in other words, there's no mismatch here. You're not getting worse people. The class is just as good overall. These people are still graduating. So if this system works and it preserves the ability for that really talented student from a bad background to come in and show, hey, I got a 36, right? Please let me in, right? Then why not do that, right? Why not do that if it's already working? So I do think testing optional is certainly a potential, viable counterplan. Now, I will be clear, there is literature out there that does attack testing optional, and we'll link to some of that. There's one by Penn State professor Kelly Ox-Rosinger in 2018 that basically says that it not only does it not work, it doesn't increase diversity, but it actually leads to there being so many more applications that selective schools become even more selective, and that ends up being bad for lower income students. So, that's that. But I do think it is a potential viable counterplan. It's just, or you could just say, we're doing it right now. You know what I mean?
Another alternative to talk about is the SAT's adversity score, since that's something that's pretty much incumbent upon us right now.
Yeah.
One of the studies that's been used to support this is a pilot that involved 8 universities, And what they found is that when admissions officers were given a dashboard that included students' disadvantages, like whether they were working a job, single parent household, the parents' income, they were 26 to 28% more likely to admit a low socioeconomic status applicant.
And that's going to correlate heavily, unfortunately, but realistically, with students of color, because that tends to be a strong correlation economically. That's huge, folks. I mean, that is, if that can be replicated, right? That would say that in the status quo, like we're about to see improvement as SAT implements its adversity score. It's not implemented yet, but as it becomes implemented, right, that's going to dramatically improve the admission of students of color and low-income students. So one argument you can make on the adversity score is, Judge, we might come back in 3 years and have this debate and decide it's time to junk these things. But right now, we're trying a critical experiment that has the potential to dramatically improve admissions rates for underrepresented students. Now is not the time to quit. We've just done the biggest sea change in these tests, maybe in their history, and we've got to keep them. But I would even go a step further than that, because I think the adversity score has another kind of tricky sort of counterplan thing to it, which is this. And I'm not a big fan of politics cases, but I think this is real because they talk about this in real literature. There's a lot of concern right now that the newly comprised conservative Supreme Court majority is at some point going to take up college admissions affirmative action and will either strike it down or will restrict it dramatically. And there are plenty of folks out there, reputable sources that you can cite, who are worried about this happening, right? This is not a made up thing. It's not something we contrived for debate. It's real, right? There's also a lot of talk about how the SAT adversity score is sort of a backdoor effort to get around that. I mean, not only does it serve as a backdoor effort, it was actually, people will argue, and sometimes conservatives argue this and they like say this is bad, but even they admit it, like this adversity score was designed to allow diversity to be considered even if the Supreme Court goes after traditional affirmative action, right? It was meant as sort of a workaround or like a lifeboat, right? Because it's very hard to strike it down because number one, it's not being done by the government, right? It's being done by a private entity. And number two, it doesn't look directly at race at all. It looks at income and things like that, but it's a close proxy. Those unfortunately are close proxies for things like race. So the argument would be that like the SAT's adversity score might be our only lifeboat for diversity if the Supreme Court strikes down affirmative action. We can't get rid of it, right? We have to preserve it because it's our only sort of last chance bomb shelter way of preserving diversity in the event that a conservative Supreme Court goes after it. But then also, in addition, Alicia strengthens it further by saying it also works. Like when I wrote that counterplan argument or the adversity score argument, I didn't have evidence that it was working, and she has been able to show that it actually seems to work. So a case that says nothing but give the adversity score a chance to work, a negative that says that could win. I mean, I think, it's
well,
just
absolutely. And another thing within this article that really strengthens this point is in a survey of college admissions representatives, the people who make the decision.
Right.
What they found is that only 29% self-reported looking at the students' adversity, like where they're living, where they went to school, whether they were looking at a job, and using that as a decision-making point. So we see that so few are already looking at that kind of thing. And honestly, self-reporting tends to be a little bit generous. Like
right.
You make yourself look better than you are. So what we see is that this isn't being taken into consideration already, and this is a way we can make it be taken into consideration by putting it at the forefront right alongside the number everyone's looking at.
So I think the gist of it kind of comes back to what Alicia said at the very beginning, which is that number one, you don't have to advocate for the status quo. And frankly, if I'm you as the negative, I probably don't, right? I probably talk about testing optional. I probably talk about the adversity score, although the adversity score is the status quo. Like it's what's happening, but you've got to point out that it's going to keep happening. But you don't need to run a traditional counterplan for it because it's going to happen under the SAT. And almost certainly the ACT is going to follow suit if it's successful, which it probably will be, right? So the second point in addition to those things is, these tests arguably help underrepresented groups hit back, argue that they do overstate performance rather than understating it. Be ready for that fight. Be ready to say it's not the test, they're not biased, it's society. If anything, the tests slightly overestimate. And then just sort of say the last thing I think is super key for the negatives. What's your alternative, Af? What are you going to do that's better? Because if you go with GPA, we're going to show you that it gets inflated for rich people. And if you go with extracurriculars, how much does it cost to join the lacrosse team or to travel around in the debate team? And if you go with interviews, we've got evidence that those are going to be biased. So really, what is going to be less bad? We know it's problematic, but what will be less bad that we will replace it with in terms of making these decisions? And I think you'll have a strong argument on the neg. I was surprised because I frankly thought, like, what are we going to do on the neg? But I was very happy with it. So with that, we will move on and do some parting thoughts.
Okay, so we're just going to wrap this up with some final thoughts about the resolution and ways that we need to approach the argumentation. So the first thing is, like we said before, you're going to face some kind of criticism if you cite a source from the College Board or from ACT. Yep. The way I've responded to that is this is the only way to get the granularity in the data that you need to be accurate. That's not the kind of information that's as easily accessible from colleges or from other like longitudinal data sets, just because colleges handle those situations in different departments. Financial aid and FAFSA information is over here, ACT scores are over here, and plus they'll have multiple scores for some students, and it's just cleaner to get the data from those sources. Second of all, it's usually paired with actual professors from reputable universities that have an invested stake in making sure that they don't look like they're bought by industry.
That's right, exactly.
It's their academic integrity at stake. So if you have a Harvard professor alongside the College Board, chances are it's pretty reputable.
I had one quick amendment note that I wanted to add too, which was, remember, we said on the app that you're going to be talking about how high school GPA is a better predictor than standardized tests, right? Remember, the negative's position on that is not just to concede it, it's to say, look, my point is not that we pick one over the other. My point is that we put them both together. And like with any statistical analysis, if you consider two factors that have some predictive value, together they're going to be better, right? And so the negative is going to be pointing out how when you consider standardized test scores and GPA together, not one or the other, you're going to get better predictions. And so you're going to want to have evidence for that. I forgot to mention that earlier, but I did want to add it. I think the biggest thing, though, that I want to say and kind of in closing is that this is a case where, frankly, all of the impacts are going to be a little ephemeral. They're going to be a little slippery, a little hard to grab onto, right? Because we're talking about statistics. We're talking about predictions and estimates that come out of statistics. It's not a case where, for example, we're talking about like arms sales to Saudi Arabia and we can point to X number of deaths. We're talking about vague 2 and 3% differences in admissions. We're talking about $50 here. We're talking about this whether X disparity is caused by one thing or the other. You've got to get really comfortable with telling simple stories to judges on these things. For example, right? Simple stories that explain the statistics, right? So for example, when you're on the negative, to say, look, yes, we agree standardized tests aren't perfect, but the affirmative has to show you a better alternative that's more perfect, that's going to lead to better representation for these groups, and we're going to show you why they can't. Simple, straightforward stuff. When you're on the AF, a simple story. Yes, first of all, these tests cost a lot of money. They add very little predictive value. They're biased, and the bias is not some residual thing. It's baked right into the test, and we're going to show you that. And you have to know the statistics so well that not only can you say the numbers, but you can explain the numbers and tell the story in a way that a judge who is dead tired after work at 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock at night on a Friday or a Saturday can understand it. You've got to be able to tell the story of what the numbers mean if you want to be able to fight on this resolution. And I think you had like a really good idea about like what you need to do with the evidence itself.
Right. If I was preparing for this kind of heavy policy debate where it's all about whose statistic is better, what you should do is you should read every card you have, and up at the top you need to put the sample size, where the data came from, how many years it looks at, and ultimate conclusions. Like, you need to know exactly what the methodology is, or at the very least a simplified version of the methodology, so you can come back at your opponent and say, no, this is a very rigorous study, 10 years, 100,000 students, 81 universities.
Yeah. And explain why it's better. Explain why, for example, a meta-analysis that covers 200,000 people is, at least on its face, better than a study that looks at 5 colleges. Be able to have those statistical fights, because if you can't, against better people, you're not gonna have a good time, right? So that's what I've got. You got anything else?
I think that's it. Just keep it simple. If you throw too many numbers at a judge, they're not going to remember any of them. So more so than the actual statistic, make sure they know the underlying principle. And like Brett said, tell a good story, slow down, make sure they know exactly what you're talking about thematically.
So we are well and truly started off for the 2019-20 school year. As always, best of luck to all of you. I envy you to be able to get out there and debate. It's a lot of fun. So have fun and make sure you put in your best effort every single round. Again, if you have questions, drop them below. The sources will be below. And again, if it's helpful, maybe like, maybe subscribe, maybe tell other folks. But just remember, debate at the end of the day is supposed to be fun. It's supposed to be enjoyable. I think this will be a good topic. So as always, we'll sign off by saying have fun, work hard, and hail state.